today is going to be public choice economics, kind of to finish off our part one of this class where we're really dealing with price theory, the pure logic of choice in economics, where we look at supply and demand and how incentives matter, the basic models of economics. We're kind of finishing that off with public choice economics. This is just a basic introduction. We have an elective here where you can go learn a lot more about public choice economics. It's part of kind of the foundation of a Hillsdale Econ degree here. Public choice is very much, near and dear to the hearts of the professors here. It's something really important, and this is just kind of a little introduction that fits within our section here on price theories. What is public choice economics? It's essentially the economics of politics, or the toolkit of economics that we've discussed so far, applied to political decision making. So we're taking the economic stuff that we've done so far, but now we're looking at our action within the political arena, or when we make choices as a public choice, right? And we're looking at this now because we've just covered the pure logic of choice, price theory stuff, all that behavior in markets, and we said this is when it works great. And then we said, ooh, but this is when it kind of fails, right? We looked at some market failure stuff like externalities or public goods problems, things like that. Well, the kind of obvious implication would be then, okay, well, then we can come in and fix those market failures or things like that. But we want to analyze government behavior as well with this same toolkit, right? We're going to look at that, and that's really what public choice economics is, using economics to analyze our public choices. So to best understand this idea of the economics of politics, public choice economics, is a story that has been passed down from many in the public choice tradition, but to me it was passed down from the late great Gordon Tullock at George Mason University, and he would always tell this story to say, this is what public choice economics is. Like, this is the essence of what's really kind of novel about public choice economics. So to me, this is the best story I have for understanding its importance. And the story is the Emperor's Singing Contest. So the Emperor has a singing contest. He wants to be entertained throughout the cold winter that's coming ahead, right? So he has all these different forms of entertainment that he's going to have. One of them is going to be singing. So he has this singing contest, right? The way that this story was told to me, this is kind of like a classic Roman literature, Greek, something like that, where we have the emperor. I updated a little bit. I think it should be a little more modern. So we have the emperor, but it's the Emperor Palpatine, right? So the Emperor Palpatine is having this singing contest. There's two contestants, and in comes the first contestant. And they're just awful, right? So the Emperor's like, oh, this is terrible. And so he says, the second guy wins. It's the problem with this story. The second guy could be worse, right? The second guy could be even worse, okay? This is a really simple story. It's not like you have to take a logic class to figure out, oh my gosh, right? Like, that's not a good decision, anything like that. But this is what public choice economics is saying. They're doing exactly this story. They're saying it's the Emperor's Singing Contest. What we've done in economics, in actual academic economics, and in the way that people think about economics when it comes to public policy and things like this, so the layman, the everyman, is we often fall victim to the Emperor's Singing Contest. We sit there and we say, oh my gosh, markets aren't perfect. Therefore, the government should do something. Well, wait a minute. That's not necessarily true. What if the government does it even worse? Right? The government is the second singer, potentially. Now, public choice economics is not meant to be, oh, let's just showcase all the ways that the government sucks, right? Like, that the government's terrible. It's saying instead what we should do is pay attention to the logic that we are following here with the Emperor's Singing Contest and have what we call analytical symmetry. Analyze the situation symmetrically. Use the same toolkit to be critical of how markets work, and then use that toolkit to be critical of how government provision would work also. Like, why would you analyze it through a different set of lenses? right? Why would we fall victim to the emperor's singing contest? Why would we be really critical of how markets work and then just say, and then the government fixes it? Well, how do they fix it? They do. They will. They'll do the right things. How? We should, like, what are the incentives there? What's happening? Do we actually get them to fix it well? Now, public choice economists usually are more skeptical of government behavior because they're actually looking at it with a skeptical eye, right? And today I'm going to present to you some of that skepticism to get you starting to think like a public choice economist, but it is not necessarily an anti-government approach. You could say the market fails terribly and government fails pretty bad, so we should have a lot of government intervention, right? But either way, if you're going to be, rigorous in your approach, you should have analytical symmetry. You should do both. Don't fall victim to the emperor's singing contest. What we need is what James Buchanan called politics without the romance, right? A politics without the romance. We have the romantic notion that as soon as it enters the realm of the politics, we'll do it right, because we can think about how it would be right. Imagine if we did this in reverse and we just said, oh, well, the markets, we can imagine how it would work, right? So no matter what, they work. Well, non-market economists would go, whoa, 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 whoa. I can think of lots of incentives where we would have externalities, public goods problems, all these, where markets would fail, right? So let's do it both ways. Let's have that analytical symmetry there. We had assumed that since markets were not perfect and could fail, the alternative was better. Part of the reason is that we assume like this sneaky, greedy, homo economicus individual in private markets that's just selfish, even though we say self-interested and all these other things. But then we assume a benevolent and omniscient behavior in the political arena. Well, like politicians are people too. So it's like magically, as soon as they enter the hall, the doors of City Hall, they change and they become benevolent and omniscient, right? That's kind of a silly thing to do when you actually break it down. So what happens when we apply the economics lens to politics? What happens when we allow the limitations and motivations of politicians to be more human? We see many different government failures to add to our theories of market failures as well. And that's what we're going to start bringing in here, is kind of use that way of thinking to think about the limitations of government behavior as well within our kind of setup of the pure logic of choice, thinking about incentives and scarcity, using supply and demand, the price theory approach to basic economics, the economic way of thinking. All right, so we're going to look at just a few of these cases over the next couple of days. And really here, I'm just going to introduce some basic concepts to you guys. So like, okay, you're going to want to know, what is XInefficiency? But that's all you're going to really have to know, is just kind of what are these concepts that we're covering. So we're going to do these overviews of public choice economics. And we're going to start where most public choice economics starts. There's a lot of research and a lot of work in the public choice economics of voting behavior. Look at voter behavior up front first here. And we're going to look at these different settings. All right, so in economics, what we usually do is we kind of look at the constraints of the situation. We have the preferences of the individual, and we basically assume optimization from that point forward. We're going to see this a lot more in part 2 of our class, but we've already kind of seen it. It's like, what's your demand schedule? What are the supply schedules? And everybody does the best thing they possibly can given the interaction of supply and demand and the prices that come about, right? It's basically saying costs and benefits both matter. Okay, costs and benefits, it all matters. So I want you to do a little thought experiment with me about how costs and benefits are different when we are in kind of a voting situation. So one example that I call it my cell phone example, and this kind of works better. I'm not going to force you guys to do it, but maybe just in your head, go there. Take your phone and you unlock it and you hand it to like the closest person to you that you don't really know. And it's unlocked and there it is, right? You do this little thought experiment. It gets you that feeling of little unease or something right there. You're in a classroom with other Hillsdale College students, and so even that, like imagine handing it to a perfect stranger, right? Maybe an 18-year-old kid with a hat on backwards and a nose ring that's looking at you like, right? Or something like that. Somebody you don't trust, right? And imagine this little thought experiment. okay? This kid could get your phone and he wants to make the best of it. So he can rummage through all of your contacts, text messages, Snapchats, who knows, all that stuff. Anything that you have on your phone, he's gonna take it and he's gonna make you look as bad as possible with it to just kind of mock you and have fun with it. And he's gonna take stuff out of context and all this kind of stuff, whatever, right? Right? He's gonna do all this stuff and trying to like smear you. How much are you willing to pay to get your phone back? If it's held hostage, essentially, and there's no other legal ramifications that can be made, you're in like this total isolated incident here, how much would you be willing to pay? Okay? That's thought experiment one. Thought experiment number two is we run into the same situation. But instead, what's going to happen is that same individual has your phone. And then they say, okay, well, I'm going to do that to you unless this happens. Unless we pick 1 out of the 25 people in here, and it happens to be you. And then we flip a coin twice, and if it comes up head both times in a row, we're still going to keep going with your phone. And then we have to pick a number 1 through 100, and if mine matches yours, we keep going. And then we have to pick a number 1 through 100 again, and if it matches, we're going to keep going again, and then I will smear you. But if any of those things go wrong, if the coin flip doesn't go that way, if I don't randomly select you out of the 25, if I don't do the 1 out of 100 and pick the same number as you twice in a row, you're fine. I'm just going to give you your phone back. How much are you willing to pay to get out of this situation? All of that I just told you, I kind of broke it down for you, is a 1 in a million chance that it will happen. Right? It's a 1 in a million chance that it will happen. But that's hard to like kind of think about how much is 1 in a million. Right? Are you willing to pay different amounts in these two scenarios to get out of the situation? Generally speaking, incentives matter, and the answer is yes, right? And so I've done this at like a high school talk where we get a bunch of high schoolers out and I make them unlock their phones, because usually they are actually probably very worried about what's on their phone, right? Like you don't really learn to be responsible with that thing right quite away, all that, and they're sitting there and they're like, oh, they get very uneasy when I have them unlock their phones and hand it to the person next to them. And then I start saying this and they're like, oh boy, what did I get into, right? Here. The amount you're willing to pay is different for both of these. Right? If I give you a 1 in a million chance at something, you act differently. Okay? I could tell you, the same kind of thing. What would you do if you knew you had $10 million at the gas station just down the road? Right now, what would you be doing? If I knew with certainty there's $10 million there for you, how would you be acting? Would you still be in class? If I were you, I would be gone. Right? Like I'd just be gone. Like I need time to process this. I am going and I'm getting that money right now. Nice class, Dr. Clark. It's been really fun. I might come back. I don't know yet. I can't think that quickly, but I'm certainly not going to be here right now. Well, there is $10 million for you at a gas station. It's in the form of a lottery ticket. It just has a probability associated with it. And you guys are acting differently. Like you are in that world where there's $10 million there for you, but it's a very, 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 very small probability, and so you behave this way. We behave differently when there's probabilities on the line. That's the basic lesson here, right? Well, when we vote, there is only a probability that we impact the outcome, right? There's only a probability are what they call the decisive voter. So there's a probability that we are the decisive voter, that we make a tie or we break a tie. Otherwise, when we go and vote, it isn't changing anything. Right? When you go to the grocery store and you buy a gallon of milk, it's not like you check out and they go, well, you got a 1 in 7 chance of going home with some milk. Right? You are going to go home with some milk. Now, there might be a 1 in 7 chance that the milk is bad or something like that, right? But again, the more that's there, it changes your behavior. Like I love kiwis, but frequently you get kiwis and they're not good. They're like, they're ripe or they're too ripe. It's just like, ugh. And so I don't buy kiwi. Even though if I knew it was a good kiwi, the price that's there, I would buy them all the time. it changes your behavior, right? This probability thing, it changes your behavior, changes the way you act. The probability that one vote will change an electoral outcome is usually approximately 0. Right? It depends on how big of a vote it is. So just yesterday, I do these random like econ experiments on my family every now and then. We do lots of voting system stuff. We voted on where we were going to do a splurge Sunday and we were going to go out to eat somewhere. And so we voted on 3 different places where we were going to go and vote. And I just did a simple like point system, right? 3 points for your top choice, 2 for your second, 1 for your last place, whatever. Well, it turned out after I had tallied all the votes, and I had already written mine down, but after I had tallied all of the votes, all 3 places had 10 points other than my vote. So whatever I said was going to be the decisive outcome, right? So we got Chinese food. It's a great day, right? Right. So I was the decisive voter. But if the score would have been, 14 to 8 to 7, it didn't matter what I voted for. I only had 3 points I could add to anything, but whatever had 14 was going to be the outcome, right? And so we look at what's the probability that we have a situation where you're actually decisive, where you make a tie or break the tie. And so a lot of times, that's in a lot of votes, the probability is quite close to 0. So the expected gain of going and voting is essentially 0 then. So think about this within the context of government behavior. The whole system is based not on the price system and property rights, but at the bedrock of everything is voting people in and voting for policies and all of this stuff. So this way of thinking should be pervasive when we analyze government behavior, is understanding that this is all, we're dealing with probabilistic elements, right? Estimates for the probability of decisiveness are less than 1 in 10 million for presidential elections. So the experiment that I just gave you guys with the phone, that was 1 in a million. The best case scenario for presidential elections, say it's super tight election, super tight race, you happen to live in a state that's very much so a swing state, right, that could change everything. Like in the best case scenario, not in an average year, it's 1 in 10 million. So to actually change the outcome of an election, you have to do that whole thought experiment that I said, plus get a 1 in 10 that hits your way. Normally, if I say 1 in 10, like if I say there's a 10% chance it's going to rain today, what do you say? I'm glad it's not going to rain today. Like that's just like 10%. Right? But now all of a sudden, when we're talking about 1 in 10, we're like, oh, that's a pretty big number. 1 in 10 times 1 in a million, right? Like, no, there is essentially 0 chance that you will actually impact a presidential election, right? And actually change the outcome of it, right? Not to mention the whole, you can get into the, if it's close at all, what happens? A recount, right? And then you have to be decisive, you'd have to make a tie or break a tie all over again and all this other stuff. It's just kind of, the chances, essentially the probability of decisiveness is 0. Now that does not mean your vote doesn't matter or that you shouldn't do it or anything like that. We just want to analyze it with the proper lens of, hey, what is your incentive to actually vote? Are you actually changing the outcome? When I say that, hey, I'm voting for what dinner is, and I already know that the score is 14 to 8 to 7, I might act a little bit differently than when I know it's 10 to 10 to 10. That's all that we're saying, right? And so we want to think about, well, how would we act differently when it's decisive or when it's not, right? We kind of want to see that situation. And so to talk about this, economists have a concept called rational ignorance, right? So you should be familiar with this concept after going through basic public choice stuff. The idea is that you're rationally not knowledgeable, you rationally have ignorance about some areas of life. So if you have a positive marginal cost, let's say of going and voting, like it takes time, you have to go down to the voting booth, you have to get registered, all these other things. It's not super costly, but it's a positive marginal cost. And essentially 0 marginal benefit, because you're not going to change the outcome, then what would be the privately optimal quantity of information that you acquire when it comes to voting? It would be 0, essentially, because you're not going to change the outcome anyway, right? And so you could be, a lot of economists talk about in the voting booth, people are rationally ignorant. There's no payoff for actually having the knowledge in that situation. There's no practical benefit to you as an individual, right? So I'm rationally ignorant about a lot of things. My go-to example for this is I don't know anything about ballet. Why would I know anything about ballet? There's no benefit to me, but I could go on YouTube and find all kinds of videos about basic ballet techniques, and I could search up Wikipedia. I could talk to students who have been in ballet, right? I can take a class in it. Why would I go through all of that cost, though? I have no desire to know anything about ballet, and I don't really see how it will help me as an economics instructor or to be a better dad or whatever. Maybe I'm wrong, right? But I see zero marginal benefit there, and I see a high marginal cost, so I'm rationally ignorant. I choose not to pursue that because I think the costs of acquiring that information are greater than the benefits of having it, right? So this leaves us a little question in public choice economics, though, that's lingering here. If this is the way we're viewing individual behavior, that there is no benefit to voting, and yet there's a cost, we have the empirical reality that people show up and vote. So if we're saying this is our model of man, what the heck's why did anybody go and vote then, essentially? Or why did, more than 300 people show up to vote? What's going on here? Well, how do economists explain voting? There's a lot of literature in this in public choice economics. I'm going to show you guys just one theory. It's kind of one of the core ones that things branch off of, but I want you just to be familiar with what's called Brennan and Lomoski's theory of expressive voting. So it's expressive voting. And this comes from Brennan and Lomoski's book, Democracy and Decision. This was one of the book that I read as an undergrad, just the first 2-3 chapters or so of it. That was kind of like one of my core, like, oh my gosh, just made me change the way that I see the world. And I was like, I can't refute what I see here. And this changes the way that I view the world. So I kind of recommend that book, just kind of perusing through the first couple of chapters and seeing their model of expressive voting. For a similar analysis, I also recommend Brian Kaplan's Myth of the Rational Voter, maybe a little bit more of a fun read. I also cover that in behavioral economics some too, if you end up taking that with me later on. But here what we're going to do is we're going to talk about Lomoski and Brennan's expressive voting model. And so what they say is they basically break economic returns into two things. We have instrumental returns, and so here I have a picture of a car. This is a very kind of instrumental car. It's a very just kind of, hey, it gets me from A to B car. Economists usually focus on the instrumental returns of goods, the instrumental value within products. What does the product do for me? What does it actually like contribute to me in terms of just kind of functionality? Investing in company A, it gives me 5% returns. Investing in company B, it gives me 3% returns. What do? I invest in company A, it gives me more returns. That's it. Like I'm looking at what does it do for me in my bottom line. Cars get us from point A to point B. That's the instrumental value that it provides to me. Watches, what do? They tell me the time, right? Well, there's also this instrumental voter assumption that we've kind of all believed when we talk about this rational ignorance story and thinking, oh, well, no one would go and vote then. If voters care nothing at all except the policies that they get and how it can actually instrumentally help them out, then we don't have a story of why people would really show up and vote in the numbers that they do. This sounds reasonable to assume that voters are instrumentally motivated, like they're sitting there and they're like, they just justify whatever actually helps themselves. You hear this a lot. You say, oh, well, you would vote for that because you're a rich white guy. Or you would vote for that because that's going to give you a tax break. Or you would, right? You hear that kind of, that's the assumption that it's all instrumental for you. It seems reasonable, but it hardly seems realistic because we have lots of evidence that says like image, symbols, face shape, things like this all matter for politicians that we vote for. Like, he just looks creepy. that's a legitimate reason to not elect a politician who might stand for the things that actually go for you. So these things seem to matter as much as the policy stances that politicians actually take. And censor vote doesn't really matter, right? What's happening here? Well, Brennan and Lemosky say, yes, instrumental returns should matter. However, there's something else that could matter in voting, and that's expressive returns. If you think about a car could get me from point A to point B, but it can do something more than that. It can say, I'm awesome, right? A car can also say, I'm a cool guy. Or it can say, I'm eco-friendly. Or it can say, like, I'm a, kind of natural rugged man, but, also stylish, right? Like, cars say something about us, and we pick out cars for those reasons, right? You don't go to the lot and then pick out a car and they say, okay, well, we have like multiple colors in that, and go, I don't care, just pick one for me, right? We're very concerned about that color, right? And not just because it's like, oh, this one will show more dirt, although some of us, are concerned about those instrumental returns, right? There's expressive returns as well. When we talked about the return on investment, now you change it to the return on investment for company A is 5%. The current return on investment for company 3 is 3%. But company A, everybody thinks is evil. And company 3, gives money back to the environment or something like that. Like everybody thinks they're like friendly and local or, whatever, all the kind of catch buzzwords that everybody likes. Now all of a sudden you might say, yeah, I'll invest in company B. What it's doing for you instrumentally is still 3% returns, but it's also expressing something about who you are. Just like a cooler car is expressing something about who you are. Just like a watch doesn't just instrumentally tell you time. It says, I have a Rolex. This is nice. I'm fancy. Or whatever, I'm hip and cool, so I have an Apple Watch. Or whatever, whatever it is, right? They all say things about us. The clothes we wear, all of these things. There's tons of expressive returns that we get all the time, every day in life. Right? And so Brennan and Lemosky, in those couple of chapters, they give this really great example. It's really morbid, so, deal with me. But it's like perfect, because it's like, you can so relate to this kind of hypothetical example, is they say, imagine you're walking, you're on a nice little nature walk on a trail along a river, and it's a really wide river, and it's a really treacherous river. But it's really pretty just to kind of walk along and all this kind of stuff. But you know that if you got in that river, it is over, right? Like, you aren't going to make it. You can't swim through that, anything like that. There's no chance. With certainty, there's no chance you can. And you're walking and have a nice day, and then all of a sudden you see somebody in the middle of the river going, help, help me. And they're drowning, and they're going to die. Like, unless something happens, they're going to die. You know it. Do you look at them and go, oh? And just keep walking? Because there's nothing you can do in this situation, right? What do? You sit there. If you were in that situation, oh my gosh, you'd like grab a stick. You'd be like, I'm 40 feet from you. Right? And you'd be like, we'll get somebody. I'll call for help. You would be scrambling and trying to express to them that you're a human being, essentially, and you care for them to some extent, like you value life. But really, all you're doing is expressing that. You're not actually helping anything. You're kind of trying to, but it's over, right? We get those kind of returns all of the time. We have, when I watch a football game in my house, I yell at the TV. And I say, no, cut back, cut back. Do I actually think it's going to change the running back to have him cut back? Or like my team is going to have a better chance of winning because I'm yelling at the TV, go, go, go. No. So what am I doing then? I'm not getting an instrumental return. I'm getting an expressive return. I'm expressing that I really like the Lions. Despite what they've done for my entire lifetime, I really like the Lions, and I want them to do better, right? That I'm on that team, right? So it's that element of expressive returns as well, right? So we have this expressive voter model that we want to consider, right? If part of the motive is expressive, then we can kind of analyze it a little bit differently. Yeah?
What were the two books called, real quick?
Brendan Lamosky's Democracy and Decision, and Brian Kaplan has a book called The Myth of the Rational Voter. And that's the one, we're not going to cover that one here, but I cover that in behavioral. So Brendan Lamosky put forward a simple model of expressive voting, and they basically say, well, what happens then, if you go and you vote, the probability of decisiveness is a real thing. Political scientists look at this. All kinds of people get really upset about the probability of decisiveness. When I say the probability of you changing the outcome is 0, and it's a mathematical thing, like there's different ways to kind of calculate it, so there's like windows, but it's mathematical. People get upset about that. So like academics have gotten upset about that, and they're like, I'm going to prove that that's not true. And they're like, crap, it's probably way less probable than I even thought, right? It's just like a mathematical reality, and we get upset about that. People don't want to hear that. Okay? So this is saying that's a reality. They're taking that as a reality. And they say, okay, well, that would impact your instrumental returns. Like if you're instrumentally going to get something, you have to factor in the probability of decisiveness, right? So you would behave based on that probability. Like if I go to the voting booth and I say, oh, I want my taxes to be lower, and so I'm going to vote for this guy, well, there's almost no chance that I'm impacting the outcome of the election, and I'd have to multiply that almost no chance by how much lower my taxes would be, right? So if it's almost 0 times anything that I get instrumentally, there's like no impact instrumentally of how I behave in the voting booth. But then they add, that's part of your return to voting, but then they add to that the expressive return that you get. Now, the question becomes, do you have to multiply the expressive return by the probability of decisiveness? Think about how people behave when they go and vote. When their guy loses, do they still get the return from having been on the right side? Right? When Hillary lost an election, did people keep their bumper stickers that said, I voted for Hillary? Did they get to talk to their friends and say, these idiots that elected this guy, oh my goodness, it would be so much better if we had Hillary? Yeah, they get to keep that return. They get to keep that feeling of, well, I did the right thing. I voted for the right individual. And the people who won, did they get to say, yeah, I'm on the right team? You get to keep that expressive return. You express that I'm on the good guy side, I'm on the blue team, or I'm on the red team, right? You get to keep that return. Just because the probability of decisiveness is near 0, for me, when I cheer at a football game that is not happening in my house, it does not mean that I do not get to keep the entire expressive return just because there's a ridiculously small chance that I'm changing the outcome. I still get that expressive return. So in their model, what you do is you multiply the probability of decisiveness times the instrumental return, and then you add to it the expressive return, but the expressive return is not multiplied by the probability of decisiveness. So a simple setup is that you do, two policies, A and B, and for both policies, you multiply the probability of decisiveness times the instrumental return plus the expressive return, and you have the net return for that policy. Well, if I tell you that the probability of decisiveness is basically 0, then what do we have here? Voters' behavior is basically expressive. And so this is the expressive voter model, saying we just like to express which team we're on. So this could explain why we go and vote. Why do you show up at the voting booth? Because you get to keep some of that expressive return. Right? You get that. And so as long as the benefit of the expressive return is greater than the marginal cost of going and voting, you would still go and vote, right? And so we can think about this, the act of voting through this lens. So voters are at the foundation of our political process, and they might make decisions or have preferences for policies that are demonstrably bad in terms of economic efficiency. They might be demonstrably bad even instrumentally for themselves, right? There's plenty of individuals out there that I think hold economic views that hurt themselves even though they don't really think it hurts themselves, right? They hold those views. Even if their goal is economic efficiency, they might hold policies that are economically inefficient because really they're just expressing something. They're expressing a certain side, right? And so I would say this about tariffs. A lot of people are like, yeah, tariffs will help the American economy. And I'm like, no, economists don't think that at all. Like at all. There's not really good logic behind it, right? Why? Because tariffs help express I'm on Team America, even though they're not instrumentally actually favorable. So they're rationally ignorant and perhaps vote expressively. Okay, so voting looks at at politicians potentially doing the wrong things, but now let's consider politicians having incentives to do too much of these wrong things, and we'll go a little quicker through these other categories. But there's been another fruitful area of public choice research called the economics of bureaucracy. So we'll look at, and we have these different incentives when we have bureaus. So bureaucracy, we can think of this, owing to the benefits of specialization in the division of labor, legislatures delegate responsibility for implementing their policy initiatives to various departments and agencies staffed by kind of career bureaucrats. These individuals secure their positions through civil service appointment rather than by democratic election, but they might be appointed by people who were voted into office or things like this. So voting can still be at the foundation here, but then these people are appointed by other people, right? You get all kinds of bureaucrats in the kind of bureaucratic agency that is DC at the federal level for the United States at least. Leading bureaucrats often are not elected, but rather appointed by the elected officials. And one early public choice model suggests that bureaucrats are simply budget maximizers, as they have no check on their preference from the preferences and actions of voters, right? There's not really, what we do is we create this bureau, and then that bureau becomes like a budget maximizing agent. It's not actually checked by the voter system. So a lot of times we say, oh, well, all public policy, it at least has this check of voters. If the voters don't want it, we'll like vote it down. Well, a bureau, once it's created, it's not like we vote in the bureau, it's not like we vote in every year like the Environmental Protection Agency's budget for the year as voters. Now we might vote for people who have something to do with the budget and all that kind of stuff, but there's a bigger removal there. Plus, we're talking about voters who might be voting expressively, so what's happening here? The check on it isn't that great. But Niskanen in public choice economics kind of led the way. There's also a great book by Ludwig von Mises about bureaucracy. They engage, what they argue is bureaus have this tendency to create incentives where people engage in empire building, essentially. That you build up the empire that is the Environmental Protection Agency or whatever it is. You're always trying to get more funding, more staff, things like that, right? So here I have this little cartoon that has like the first store, the chairman of the task force to reduce government bureaucracy, and next to it, the vice chairman of the task force to reduce government bureaucracy, right? And you can imagine there's stuff like this, right? Like, it's like, oh yeah, we can all say, we'd like to reduce the red tape. But then in doing so, often it's just like, we need a task force to analyze this, right? You're like growing the red tape of the system when you look at it. So if you think of a bureau, say for the environment, right? Think about this. Is an individual who's in the bureau for the environment there because they think environmental regulation is a good thing, or they would like to get rid of environmental regulations and they don't want anything done for the environment? Like, who's there? It's people who believe in that bureau, essentially. Like, it'd be really weird for me to be like, oh yeah, I think we should reduce environmental regulations. I'm gonna commit my career to working for the Environmental Protection Agency and try and be the guy who tears it down from within. Now, even if I want to do that, to tear it down from within, think of like the incentives on a day-to-day basis that I face. How fun would it be to show up for work? Everybody hates me. I mean, everybody's looking to get rid of me. How easy is it going to be for me to advance, to get promotions, things like this, right? my basic rule for this, I call this, there are no Ron Swansons. Right? Like, it just doesn't happen. There are no Ron Swansons. If you don't know the reference, you should figure it out, right? Like, you should just spend some time and binge watch Parks and Rec. But Ron Swansons don't really exist. There's very, very, very few of them, right? And then what happens, what are your incentives if you're there? What are your incentives if you get a larger bureau and you're in charge of it? Now what happens? Politically, you're a really powerful individual. Now people might start talking about you as, you know, the next vice president or the next, you know, this and that, because look at, they're not only the head of this bureau, they're head of this wonderful, magnificent, really large bureau, right? All the incentives are there to build the empire. Lots of times, you know, budgets that you have, it's use it or lose it. It's like, oh, we get $4 million this year. We only spent $2 million. Let's throw a party, right? You know, whatever it is, right? You would spend that. There's all kinds of wacky incentives when it comes to a bureau. Okay, so that's just kind of a quick whatever. So we covered politicians being supported by ignorant and expressive voters. And now we see that bureaucrats are prone to overspending and broadening government budgets. These two glimpses at politics with the lens of economics, it showcases politicians doing the wrong things, potentially, and doing the wrong things too often. Now, for our third and kind of final example here, I'm going to say, what about politicians doing what they do, but having incentives to the point where even what they do it poorly? So if we look at people acting in a political setting, this with this concept called XInefficiency. So XInefficiency was originally an idea that was published in an AER paper in 1966 by Harvey Liebenstein. And he wasn't really explicitly talking about government intervention, but I think his concept applies to government behavior quite well. So it's this concept of XInefficiency. I think my little subtitle here actually does a very good job of describing what XInefficiency is. The subtitle is, there really wasn't much competition for what the subtitle should be, so it's kind of lame. This is the idea of XInefficiency. When you don't face competition, you don't reduce your costs, you don't kind of push your productive capabilities, you don't get what we call in economics productive efficiency. When a firm has little incentive to control its costs, they could kind of balloon, or they certainly won't get reduced all the way. And this can cause the average cost of production to be higher than necessary. So when you don't have competitive pressure, you could have this. Liebenstein told this story in the context of a monopoly, but what's like a more strong monopoly than government behavior in areas, right? So public choice economists can turn this onto the public sector side as well. You know, competition energizes firms to seek productive efficiency gains and produce at lowest possible costs. When we're precluded from this, we don't reduce those costs, right? We're not going to get all of the way there. So XInefficiency, an important distinction here is it only looks at the outputs that are produced given certain inputs. It's not looking at allocative efficiency, like are we making the right stuff and using the right inputs for it. It doesn't take into account whether the inputs are the best ones for using or anything like that. It's just saying, given our inputs and our desired goal, do we do it well? So for example, a firm that employs brain surgeons to dig ditches could be X efficient. It could have, you know, an absence of X inefficiency. But there's no way allocatively we should have brain surgeons digging ditches. We should have them helping people save their lives and all these other things, right? But we want to look at not that problem, like, hey, given that we have brain surgeons digging ditches, do they dig them well? If they dig them well, fine. If they don't, if they're lazy and all that kind of stuff, then we could have X inefficiency. So it's not looking at what we do, it's looking at basically how well do we do the given task that we have, given the inputs and all that stuff, right? It's not finding the cheapest suppliers because, you know, we've always used this supplier, and so let's just keep doing it, right? I was actually kind of proud in teaching this, even though, you know, there's other costs and benefits here, and I don't know that they're right. But like Hillsdale College, I found out every couple of years assesses its food delivery services for like Saga, right? We call it Saga still. It used to be Saga's company. It's no longer that company because we looked at it and said, man, we can get like the same quality product but for cheaper from this other group. And so they weren't just sticking on their laurels and saying, there's no competition here. Who cares about the cost? The students will pay higher tuition, whatever. Like they were assessing it. In government behavior, do we ever just kind of go with the status quo? Yeah. Without competition in a monopoly, do we ever do that? Possibly, right? Kind of out of inertia, you might get those things. Another example, fancy office furniture, right? Rather than just kind of general business costs, you just kind of are like, well, this is the nice stuff, right? You're not really trying to, on the margin, figure out costs and benefits on things. You just kind of go with the easiest route, and so sometimes you get these kind of lazy decisions made. All right, public choice economics, we've introduced some of the concepts today. We're saying we might do the wrong things supported by our vote. We might do these things too much because bureaus balloon in size. And well, maybe the last part's a good thing, that we do these things poorly. We might have XInefficiency. This is kind of a joke of ideas here about what the government could do to some extent, because we're just picking on the bad things now and not contrasting it with the bad things that markets could do or whatever. But we're at least starting to look at government behavior with that same critical eye. It means having that same lens, having analytical symmetry when it comes to markets and governments, being critical on both sides, right? It could be that markets are even worse, right? It could be the case. But what we're doing is we're saying use price theory, the pure logic of choice for the good. Use it to understand the world around us, not just to see how markets work, not just to see how markets fail, but to also see how governments work or how governments fail, right? We can use the same toolkit to look at our public choices. So me as a public choice economist, sometimes people will say, they'll hear this like kind of introduction or figure out what public choice is. They'll be like, that's ideological. It's just purely anti-government, right? I say this is just kind of a logical approach to considering the costs and benefits of both sides. I think that if you're honest and forthright, all analysis would include asking three basic questions. I think these are three great questions that you should always ask yourself as an economist when you look at a situation, whether it's markets or public choices. You should, well, what incentives exist in this situation? What incentives do the various parties face at each decision node? What knowledge do they have at each decision node? Like, where is the knowledge coming from? Is it coming from one individual? Is it coming from multiple individuals? Where is the knowledge coming from? What knowledge does each decision maker actually hold? And what feedback mechanism is in place for the inevitable missteps that is mankind? We will make mistakes. What feedback mechanisms are in place to correct errors? I think that is probably the most important of them all, right? Because we're going to have to make adjustments and adaptations. Raising these three questions in each and every proposed policy shift, to me, is not biased. And it certainly isn't political or simply anti-government. It should be required of all serious analysis and proposed public policies. That's just good economics. Good economics is comparative economics. I do not think this is just, political bias. This seems like no-brainer, following the logic of the emperor's singing contest. Have analytical symmetry. We ask these questions when it comes to markets, and we should ask these questions when it comes to politics too. To do anything short of this for both economics and then also politics would be falling victim to the emperor's singing contest. Yet almost always people are offended by even considering any limitation or imperfection to political action. That quick revulsion and unwillingness to think critically almost proves the point of having a romantic vision of politics, doesn't it? Right? That logic where it's like, oh no, you can't say anything negative about it. It sounds like emotion there to me. Quite frankly, that's creating an idol. Don't let political action become your idol. The logic of choice and price theory with public choice economics says, have analytical symmetry, not an idol when it comes to public choices.